Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Achieving Supply Chain Transparency. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is sponsored by Amazon Business. Our speaker today is Karen Zheng. Karen is a Sloan School Career Development Professor and an Associate Professor of Operations Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Karen, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here today and share with you some of the key lessons that we have learned through a decade-long of research on the topic of supply chain transparency. And one of the goals that I also would like to achieve today is to help inspire further ideas on how companies can craft a path forward toward transparency through business innovation. And so we can enable positive changes in global supply chains, particularly with respect to social and environmental practices. Now, briefly about myself, I grew up in China and did my bachelor's and master's degrees in Tsinghua University, which I often proudly say is the MIT in China. Then I went to Stanford for my PhD degree in management science and engineering, and very luckily, upon completing my PhD degree, landed a job at MIT Sloan as a faculty member in the operations management group. I have been at Sloan since 2011, and my passion as an academic is to use my knowledge and expertise to help improve the world, both through research and education. And naturally, I am drawn to the topic of sustainability. In my research, I consider sustainability more broadly as encompassing both environmental and social responsibility issues. In particular, I have been working on the topic of supply chain transparency in both how companies can achieve transparency in their complex supply chains and how transparency can be utilized to drive behavior change. Now, why do we care about supply chain transparency? I am sure you are all aware of several high-profile incidents in the past 2 decades, from labor abuse in Foxconn factories to the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. These tragedies not only reveal to us how tremendous social and environmental impacts that our global supply chains have, but also highlight that how little do we know about the practices in them. Most recently, in November 2020, a large group of global brands, including Nike, Amazon, H&M, Zara, IKEA, you can name many of them, were brought in front of the UK Parliament to address claims regarding the potential exploitation of Uyghurs in their supply chains. And these claims came out from a study published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. These brands, one by one, had to respond to questions about how their companies maintain visibility and combat modern slavery in their supply chains. Now, these examples all illustrate that for many industries, supply chain transparency is no longer a nice to have, but actually becoming an expectation now. Emerging regulations, activists, consumers, and even investors are all pressuring companies to establish responsible practices in their supply chains. Now, for example, ESG investing is actually becoming more and more important these days. In the US, it is estimated that environmental and social problems erased $500 billion worth of value from public companies over the 5-year period from 2015 to 2019. A key step to ensure responsible practices in the supply chain is indeed to obtain supply chain transparency and understand where are challenges for enacting those practices. However, it is not easy to do so. In a 2016 survey by the Sustainability Consortium, over 80% of the 1,700 companies surveyed commented that their companies lack full visibility into the practices of their suppliers. And over 50% of them actually had no visibility at all. At the same time, improving visibility is quite costly and resource intensive. Just to give you an example, in 2014, the consumer electronics industry spent over $700 million and 6 million staff hours to try to make sure their supply chains are free of conflict minerals. Yet, despite all of these efforts, many companies are still unsure whether their products are conflict-free. Now, a third challenge is also that companies often do not know what kinds of information their customers and stakeholders really want to know. So they need to figure that part out in order to make sure their investment in transparency can yield the best return. To try to tackle these challenges, in our research, we dissect supply chain transparency into two key components. The first is what we call supply chain visibility. This is about gaining information and knowledge about practices in the supply chain and trying to motivate better practices. And the second one is what we call disclosure or communications to the public. This is about providing information to the public and let them know what is actually the practices that are happening in your supply chain. And as you can see, giving visibility is a prerequisite. Gaining visibility is a prerequisite for a company in order to communicate the information that they collect to the public. So today, I am going to primarily focus on the dimension of supply chain visibility and would like to share with you how companies can gain visibility into their supply chains. Now, with that, one of the things that companies have been doing quite a bit is to rely on audits. So traditionally, they have relied on auditing to monitor their suppliers' practices. However, there are a number of key drawbacks about auditing that could potentially prevent companies gaining true visibility into their supply chains. First, audits are very costly, and because of that high cost, audits are conducted with relatively low frequency. So they only provide an infrequent snapshot of the supplier's practices. Second, for that same reason of the high cost, they also drive most companies to only audit their immediate tier 1 suppliers. Now, this is actually going against the nature of the problem because data has actually consistently shown that the most severe social and environmental problems are actually occurring in the upper tiers of a supply chain. For example, in a 2013 SEDEX report, tier 2 suppliers were found to commit 18% more non-compliances than tier 1 suppliers, and tier 3 committed 27% more than tier 1. Unfortunately, these upper tiers are currently out of the reach of many of the regular audits. A third key drawback is that there is also evidence that suppliers can game audits and hide information that they don't want the auditors to see, and this is really annihilating the purpose of the audits to begin with. So we do agree that auditing is certainly a necessary tool to increase supply chain visibility. And actually, companies are finding ways to improve the efficiency of their audits and by counteract some of these drawbacks. But we believe that companies ultimately need to expand their toolbox beyond auditing to truly gain supply chain visibility. Now, one of the things that people may be thinking is how can we get more granular data and more higher frequency data? And perhaps one approach that may immediately jump into many people's minds and have gotten a lot of hype recently is the use of advanced technologies such as blockchain or Internet of Things. Now, no doubt, these technologies can provide very granular and high frequency data with the potential to offer unprecedented insights into supply chain practices. But I want to challenge, is blockchain or IoT really the panacea? To answer this question, let me first share with you two interesting stories. The first story is about a startup called Context Labs. This is a company that specializes in providing companies with trustworthy data integration through blockchain technologies and using those integrated data to offer analytics-driven insights. Their initial focus is the oil and gas industry. where they can actually leverage the existing IoT infrastructure and a number of public data that already exist to measure the carbon performance and related risks in the production sites in real time. These insights actually allow the companies that they work with to more proactively manage potential risk events and also to actually benefit from carbon credits. In this case, the adoption of blockchain and IoT to gain visibility is actually quite successful. Now, the second story I want to share with you considers another startup called Goodio Chocolate. In the picture here is the founder of Goodio Chocolate, Jukka. So Goodio is a Finnish craft chocolatier that aims to provide radical transparency into the supply chain behind their products. And in order to achieve that, they experimented with using blockchain technology to trace raw materials and wages in their cacao supply chain. Unfortunately, as indicated on the slide, the experiment failed, and it failed for two main reasons. First, the smallholder cacao farmers that they source from do not actually have the knowledge and capabilities to operate an advanced technology such as blockchain. It took a lot of training, but in the end, the take-up rate is still very low. Second, the mode of trading with these smallholder farmers, and actually is very common in many developing countries, largely relies on verbal agreements rather than formal written contracts. And so there is no existing infrastructure to properly document the relevant information, nor do the farmers have much motivation to change how they are doing things. We can see from these two stories that advanced technologies certainly do not apply universally. And companies really need to be mindful of what it takes in the specific application at hand in order to make them useful. In the particular context of gaining supply chain visibility, there are at least two major barriers that must be overcome. The first is the lack of technical, human, and process infrastructures to achieve transparency, just like in the case of Goodio's failed blockchain experiment. There, the people involved do not have the capability and knowledge to process the technology or to use the technology. There's also not an existing process for people to collect and document information properly. Now, the other major barrier is misalignment of incentives. This often occurs in large supply chains that involve multiple parties with potentially conflicting interests. Let me give you an example. Consumer-facing brands downstream probably feel a lot of pressure and need these days to improve transparency. However, upstream suppliers usually do not have the same sense of urgency or even the same level of interest in providing transparency. That is because for these suppliers, their sourcing practices and their own supply chains are part of the value proposition that they offer to downstream buyers. So from their perspective, being more transparent would potentially decrease their leverage in the supply chain because they're disclosing these advantages to their buyers, and this could potentially lead to them being eventually squeezed out from the supply chain. So you see, technologies alone cannot solve these systemic problems, and instead, we really need business innovation to happen in order to address them. So what I want to do next is to share with you a few examples of how innovative organizations are designing solutions to actually overcome these two types of barriers. The first example I want to share considers how organizations are trying to solve infrastructure constraints, or even more precisely, how to work under the current infrastructure constraint to obtain visibility in the supply chain. And this is an example of utilizing crowdsourcing platforms to get information deep in the supply chain in informal settings. A number of organizations such as SEDEX in partnership with Wider and Elevate by acquiring LaborLink are using this approach with initial success. In particular, they leverage everyday technologies such as cell phones that are increasingly available to workers and farmers in the developing world. They develop a safe communication channel that is available 24/7, through which workers can call or text to report potential labor and safety issues occurring at the factory floor. As you can see, these platforms not only allow workers to have a voice, but also give suppliers and downstream buyers a scalable way to obtain real-time visibility. Very interestingly, the increasing number and scale of data collected through these platforms also trigger another emerging innovation. That is, organizations are using predictive analytics to be more proactive in managing social and environmental risks in the supply chains. For example, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery is partnering with Elevate to use their large-scale worker voice data to help buyers detect unauthorized subcontracting and forced labor and other issues in informal garment factories in Bangladesh and India. Similarly, SEDEX is also developing methods to combine audit reports with worker voice data and other data sources such as utility bills and shuttle schedules from the factories to try to uncover the true picture of factory practices. The idea here is that every single data source represents one piece of the puzzle, and by piecing them together, we are more hopeful to see the complete picture. Now, moving to the incentive side, downstream buyers, especially large ones, have historically leveraged their market power to compel suppliers to be transparent and share information. Now, this certainly represents a first step to bring suppliers on board. We do contend that solely relying on sticks is not a sustainable approach. In order to gain suppliers' trust and maintain their participation, it is important to show them the carrots. These can be in the form of granting preferred supplier status, offering better contracts, or even jointly investing in capacity building at the supplier side. Now, even more effective and, in our opinion, more critical and important is education. Is to educate suppliers to see the long-term benefit of transparency. We believe that the conversation must shift from seeing transparency as yet another requirement for compliance to viewing it as a way to achieve cost savings. For example, reducing disruption-induced downtime or having better employee retention. And eventually, really seeing it as an opportunity to create business values, winning more contracts or attracting new buyers. Now, it is important to actually point out that such type of education and mentality shift must also happen within the buyer's own organizations, especially at the upper management level. Too often, we have heard from practitioners that initiatives such as these encounter substantial internal resistance because top management is not committed and not willing to dedicate the necessary resources. So the conversation shifting from compliance to opportunity must happen throughout the entire supply chain. In that spirit, next I would like to demonstrate to you several ways with which transparency can bring new business opportunities to organizations. Now, many of you likely already see how having better insights into your supply chain can create opportunities to enhance its efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, by reducing disruption events and the related remediation costs. So what I want to do here is to focus on the other 2 points, how transparency can enable better communication to the public, and how that could create an opportunity for an organization to take a leadership position in the industry and shape new market trends. The first, I would like to share with you an example about the better communication point. And this is regarding a research collaboration that my colleagues and I have engaged with Goodyear Chocolate to help them improve their social responsibility communications with their consumers. As mentioned earlier, Goodyear is a Finnish chocolate startup that prides itself in providing radical transparency into its supply chain. However, it has been struggling with getting the desired market return on that transparency, in part because they don't know what information best resonates with their target customers. So we worked with them to answer that question. And in particular, we conducted consumer studies to measure how consumers' intention to purchase Goodyear products may change when different types of sustainability information is being presented with the product. To be more precise, here is the type of information that we present to the consumers in our study. We vary the information along two dimensions, whether it's about paying a fair price to cacao farmers or engaging in community development in underdeveloped regions, and whether the message takes the form of telling a story from the beneficiary's perspective or simply stating the facts. So let me read some of these messages that we designed together with Goodyear from the screen here. For example, fair pricing, fact-based messages. What we show to the consumers is this picture here and also the following statement. Artisan cacao, we use a fictitious brand name in the study. Artisan cacao purchases cacao beans produced by farmers at $5 per kilogram, a price significantly higher than the industry's average price of $2.1 per kilogram cacao beans. Now, for fair pricing under a story-based message, we quote a statement from a cacao bean farmer saying that working with artisan cacao allowed me to trade cacao beans at a fair price to ensure a good income for my family. So again, we design our study such that one of these messages may appear together with the product, and consumers will state how likely are they going to purchase the product when they see the corresponding message. And we test the effect of presenting one of these messages on consumers' purchase intention as compared to the baseline condition of no messaging at all. So the baseline condition, consumers only see the product and state how likely are they going to purchase the product. And prices are kept the same across all the conditions. And because Goodyear has two major markets, Finland and the US, we also do the test in the two major markets. Now, the results actually are quite interesting, and let me show you a summary of what we find. There are two main findings I want you to take away from this slide. First of all, in either market, presenting any message is beneficial as compared to no message. So the graph here shows how the average purchase intention that we collected from the consumer subjects vary depending on whether they are in the condition of seeing no message or in the condition of seeing a community development message, either story-based or fact-based, or seeing a message about fair pricing, again, either story-based or fact-based. So as we can see from both figures, the purchase intention associated with any of the messages is significantly higher than the purchase intention under no message. And this is true for both Finland and US markets. So this result shows that indeed, consumers increasingly consider sustainability attributes of a product in their purchase criteria. And companies who can demonstrate transparent information on these attributes can gain market benefit. Now, the second interesting insight from this study is highlighted in these green circles here. Notice that in Finland, story-based messaging actually leads to the largest increase in consumers' purchase intention. However, in the US, consumers tend to react more strongly to fact-based messaging. So this contrast actually shows that what information best resonates with consumers can vary by region. And companies should not take for granted that communications that work well in one region would necessarily work in another region. And instead, they should take an evidence-based approach to try to identify what is the best communication strategy in a target market in order to achieve maximum market benefit. So that is the example regarding how transparency can now enable better communication to the public. Another important opportunity that comes with better supply chain visibility is that it can enable a company to take a leadership position within its industry. And let me illustrate this point through the example of Taylor guitars. Like other guitar makers, Taylor Guitars is a big buyer of wood, and especially ebony wood. Historically, the company sourced its ebony wood from a mill called the Krolikan Mill in Cameroon. And the mill sourced its raw wood from several small suppliers in the region. In 2011, when Taylor executives visited the mill in order to learn about their practices and sourcing process, they discovered some very disturbing facts. Among them, one of them is how wood suppliers had actually need to cut down on average 10 trees in order to find one tree with the desired pure black color, just because there is a strong industry preference for pure black ebony wood rather than ebony wood with stripes. The workers told Taylor executives that if they had shipped the striped ebony wood to the mill, they would reject it. And so they have to actually find out, cut many more trees in order to get the pure black ebony wood in order to receive the price that they deserve. So learning about these facts, Taylor executives are very determined to change this very unsustainable practice. And so they decided to purchase the Krolikan Mill and vertically integrated its ebony supply chain. By doing that, they started to accept striped wood from the suppliers at the same price as pure black wood. And in addition, by owning the source of the ebony, the company started to sell wood to its competitors. Being both a supplier and a producer, they now help to re-educate both consumers and competitors to accept striped wood, and as a result, significantly improve the sustainability of ebony wood supply. Now, Taylor Guitar is not an isolated example. Other transparent companies like Patagonia in the apparel industry and Starbucks in the coffee industry, they are all increasingly playing an active role in shaping industry standards and new market trends to create new business opportunities for themselves. To conclude, I would really like all of you to take away from this webinar 3 important lessons. First, to truly gain supply chain visibility, audits are only part of the solution. It requires companies to expand their toolbox by introducing new methods. Second, technology is only a means to an end. Gaining supply chain visibility is not just about making technology investments, but instead, it requires business innovation that addresses infrastructure and incentive barriers. And I hope the examples that I shared today can inspire even more innovative ideas to achieve those goals. And finally, I want to emphasize that education is key. A shift in mentality is really needed from viewing transparency as yet another requirement for compliance to seeing it as an opportunity to improve both internal efficiency as well as to create new business opportunities for the organization. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our Q&A sessions now.
Thank you, Karen. I'll give you a second to turn on your camera, and we'll move into the Q&A. Just a reminder for our audience, you can add your questions to the questions section of the control panel, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. And their questions are already flooding in, so let's get right to it. Karen, on balance, very difficult question to start. What is the biggest challenge to achieving supply transparency supply chain transparency? Is it technical, operational, or cultural?
So I think that I would say cultural and then operational and then least technical. As I said, and this is very related to my point about education and mentality shift, right? So in our conversation with various practitioners, they repeatedly mention that, especially when you are dealing with suppliers in, underdeveloped regions and developing countries, they do not, it's not in their mindset about being transparent and being forthcoming in terms of sharing information. Many of them actually do not have the necessary policies and processes in place to actually do that. It's not even just that they're not willing to do it, it's they don't even know what they need to do. So there's a lot of cultural differences when you go to those remote regions, and education and to change that mindset and change that culture is really a critical first step. And it takes a lot to initiate that first step.
So you call it the first step, but technically, does it need to be the first step? In other words, if it's the hardest thing to challenge, might there be an argument that says you should actually begin with operational because it's more within your control?
Well, the issue is if first of all, in a lot of these settings, data resides in those suppliers, right? So if the suppliers are not willing or don't really have the capabilities to give you the information, even if you have all the operational processes planned very well downstream, you don't have the input, right? It's like you have a computer with the best program in the world, but if you don't have input and data into that program, it's not going to give you any output.
Mm-hmm. So next question, I think, kind of stays in the same general area, kind of setting aside the question of how we achieve the visibility we require, the barriers to which and solutions you addressed extensively in the presentation. What about the responsibility question? How deep into a supply chain and how wide into the network of relationships your suppliers themselves manage does your responsibility go? Is it infinite?
That's definitely a great question, and a question that we also grapple with a lot, both in our own research as well as in our conversation with practitioners. Now, there are definitely I would say at least two different leagues, right? When you talk to small companies like Goodyear Chocolate, their supply chain is relatively simple. And so their whole idea or vision is really built upon this idea that they have complete visibility end to end, right? So they go all the way to the very first step, which is growing the cacao beans, to packaging, to distribution, to final consumer market. So they are trying to own the entire supply chain and provide radical transparency there. Now, if you think about a supply chain as complex as the one of Nike's, right, then it is very, very difficult for a company, even if they have the will, right, to actually own the entire supply chain. Just because, for suppliers in the very upstream of their tiers, they could potentially engage in some unauthorized actions, such as unauthorized subcontracting, without company such as Nike very far away from the region to know about. And that's why I think, again, going back to the point, education is important, right? How do you make that change to tell the suppliers that, really, this is not sustainable, not responsible behavior, and how we can work together to actually eliminate those behaviors?
We've had a number of questions looking for your kind of thoughts on how to manage some potential trade-offs. The supplier who lacks transparency might be exploitive, but it's a very low defect rate, versus the supplier who has better transparency, who is not exploitive, who's managing their carbon footprint well, but has an inferior defect rate, right? In the heat of the challenge to meet your business goals, to satisfy the market, isn't the lower defect rate always going to win out?
I often got that pushback and challenge. And my viewpoint, I took a very strong viewpoint, and you can disagree with me, is that we don't need to make that trade-off. I believe that fundamentally, if you build a deep working relationship with your suppliers, not maintaining an arm's length kind of relationship, and work with them, collaborate with them, then you can achieve both. You can get both good quality of raw materials and components and products, as well as making sure that these are achieved under responsible practices. We are all very well known of examples of, at least in the operations field, of Toyota, right? Toyota production system has been, championed for many decades. And they are the very, very first to demonstrate to the world, you actually do not need to sacrifice quality for time to market, which was in the past, and maybe even today, a very strong stance, believed by many, many companies that if I want to rush to the market, I need to sacrifice on quality of products. But they show us there is a way. If you design the system well, if you have the right culture, the right commitment, you actually can achieve that. And you don't necessarily need to trade off those attributes. And I have the same view in terms of sustainability and functional quality of the product.
So as we think about how we're analyzing, right, the performance of our suppliers, in order to manage those trade-offs effectively, can you talk about some of the data consistency challenges and how you've seen organizations kind of harmonize, for lack of a better word, very different data streams to kind of make these measurements?
So are you talking about that when there's inconsistency, for example, from your audit reports and other data sources to really try to understand the picture? Is that the question?
Well, I think that's one, but I think also just different types of data being measured by different suppliers. And I mean, I think maybe the question is it on you, right, to set the standard and say, this is what I need, you need to follow it? Or does there need to be some, more cooperation?
Mm-hmm. I am all for more collaborative approaches. So I think that currently this is definitely something that has not been done to the fullest extent. And as I mentioned, leading organizations such as SEDEX in this field is still experimenting on methods of how to reconcile data inconsistency problems. So I think that, thinking at a very high level, right? So there are data provided internally and there are data that are collected externally. And oftentimes, external data holds a more objective view of things compared to internally provided data. And so to the extent possible, if organizations can use external data to try to triangulate and verify, the internally obtained data, that's always a good, at least a good approach and good check in the process. But this is definitely a difficult challenge that I don't think a very good, well-defined solution has been identified.
Thank you. We know how slow most companies are to change, especially when they're not being forced to. And you mentioned the carrot and the stick with respect to incentives between organizations. Mm-hmm. But what about the bigger stick, the one wielded by governments and regulators or within trade agreements? Is there a role for public sector involvement in achieving greater supply chain transparency?
Oh, tremendously, tremendously. So I'm going to tell a joke. So people talk about regulator pressures. So we always joke that the only thing that can be slower than publishing an academic paper, which often sometimes take a long, long time, is regulation. So I have this funny story from one of my best friends, and we are still collaborators to date. He, started his first paper on potentially hazardous materials, particularly concerning BPA, and how companies should design strategies to, replace potentially hazardous substances in their products with, safer and healthier alternatives. And he started the research and then finished and then published the paper like 5-6 years later. And yet, throughout the entire process, regulation still has not changed. Yeah. And only after that, very recently, there is starting to have, bans on using BPA in baby products, and then eventually more and more in mainstream plastic products. So Yes, I believe and I strongly believe that regulators and more broadly activists, right, and NGOs, they play a very important role in moving the needles. And I really want them to move even faster, right? There are certainly some pioneering examples, such as, so for example, Australia, UK, they all have the Modern Slavery Act, and there is also the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. These are all, regulatory pressures and regulations that emerged recently to pressure companies, to compel them to really be more transparent and responsible in their supply chains. But I really hope to see more and faster actions in that space.
Are some industries embracing the move towards transparency, and maybe specifically some of the things you talked about in your presentation? Are there industries that stand out as exemplars, and who are the laggards?
Yeah, so I think that if you think about, relate this to fair trade movement, right? So I think that the industry, the coffee industry, the chocolate industry, these are industries at a more advanced stage compared to industries such as apparel and consumer electronics. I would say, I would not I would not pinpoint one of them to be the least the most lagging, but I would just say, the more advanced is, the cacao, coffee, and chocolate. And I know that there's recently a lot of effort going into also fresh produce. So that is another industry that is catching fairly quickly in terms of making changes.
So to what do we attribute that? Do you think that consumers are more sensitive to things that we're putting in our bodies, for instance, than on our bodies, right? And that the drive is, I want to know no one was exploited in this cup of coffee or in this bar of chocolate, right, or in this head of lettuce. And somehow we don't care as much when it comes to, say, clothing.
Yeah, I think you are definitely on. Yeah, you're definitely correct. Like, I do believe that once things are related to nutrition and health, people become more sensitive, and that's potentially why we see more changes and faster changes that are happening in food and beverage industries, as compared to, other products that we just put on us, not in us, right? So clothes, you wear it, even though you don't realize, the chemicals that are released from your clothes could be you could be just easily the same level of, health impact compared to things that you eat. And then, for consumer electronics, these are things that even farther away from something that will, actually affect my health. And I think that, especially for very cost sensitive consumers, right? And markets that are not educated to understand all these environmental and social impacts that are not internalized to consumers themselves, it could be challenging to, educate the consumers to realize why it is important to consider these issues.
I imagine the complexity of the supply chain has something to do with it as well, right? A coffee supply chain, a chocolate supply chain, a produce supply chain. It may be complicated, and I'm not diminishing how hard it is to achieve both transparency and good practice, but certainly it's less complicated than the supply chain to produce the next great iPhone. So
right, that's correct. I mean, and part of it is also, I think, we are talking about, products with relatively fewer ingredients. So I'm not even, so this will be very different from processed food. I don't think the processed food industry is as well as the fresh produce and like the simple, coffee and chocolate with, relatively simple ingredients. And this is precisely to your point that, the complexity of these supply chains are a little bit easier to manage compared to some of these other that have like hundreds of, raw materials and ingredients or components coming into the final product.
I mean, does that mean that we should, I'm not sure who we is in this sentence, but does that mean that we should be more patient with certain industries than others, or should our demands and expectations be consistent?
I don't know. I'm losing patience a little bit because, things have happened for a long time. And I feel that, for apparel and consumer electronics industry, perhaps in part is that we don't have a strong group of leaders that stand out early enough, and perhaps also because of the very substantial competitive pressure. You always have a low-cost competitor out there that threatens to grab your market share, and these industries have slim margins and etc. So it's and also coupled with what you're saying, that because they're not related to nutrition and health, consumers also don't have that bigger drive of moving demand, right? And so I feel all of these factors are contributing to that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I can see that. And in the cases where, there are leaders, say in the apparel industry, Patagonia, who you mentioned, who has, of course, built their brand, not just on quality of product, but they built their brand on supply chain visibility. I mean, kind of a remarkable story. And when you walk around with your Patagonia vest, you're actually sending a message, right? Not only am I rich enough to afford this, but I actually care, right, about. So I mean, but somehow that doesn't translate to, say, consumer electronics.
Yeah, I think also part of it is that so it's interesting when you compare food or agricultural supply chain with apparel and consumer electronics supply chain. The structures are quite different in the sense that both of them are complex, but the structures are quite different in the sense that in the agricultural supply chain, you also have a lot of smallholder farmers in the upstream, but typically one smallholder farmer or one village is going to supply to one buyer. So if the buyer can get a hold on where is the region that they are sourcing from, the buyer can actually exert quite a lot of influence on those farmers to change their practices and build visibility and build supply chains, build transparency. But that is not really the case for apparel and consumer electronics, in the sense that a lot of these subcontractors, they have shared capacity, right? So Patagonia, they won't be able to use the entire capacity of one factory. They are only one of the orders that they have. And so it is very hard if you don't have a critical mass that constitute 80 or 90% of the order size of one factory. Then it's very hard to motivate that factory to change, because it's hard for them to change one product line for Patagonia and then the rest remain the same, right? They would just do the same process for everybody. And that is a challenge that we often hear from this industry because of that shared capacity.
Well, and that raises the question of whether or not a smaller company has less responsibility to be a leader than a larger company, right? If a small organization doesn't really have either the leverage with their suppliers or maybe some of the capabilities, that you've mentioned to actually kind of produce visibility, is it fair for smaller companies to just leave it to the bigger companies?
I will not look at it this way, though. I will look at it more from an opportunity perspective, right? So you are small, competing with the big gorillas in the industry in the traditional way is probably not going to, it's much hard. It's very hard to work out, right? I mean, they have been there, they dominated the market for so long, and now you're a small, no brand, company coming in. What is the edge, right? I feel that a lot of the small rising companies are actually using sustainability attributes as a way to enter this highly competitive market. Now, of course, it's very hard for them to, try to move the entire industry. And so I think that I admire a lot of these very passionate entrepreneurs and how they, try to not only through their own supply chain, construct their own supply chain to establish those practices, but also through a successful business, building connections with these larger brands, and then try to influence also larger brands to change. And I have a lot of admire of those entrepreneurs, and the courage and their determination of driving changes.
You can definitely see how a commitment transparency can be a real attribute of a disruptive entrant into an organization.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
A little bit harder for the legacy organization, to play on that. We used to be bad and we're not anymore. But I guess that's better. Sorry, that was very flip.
That's why regulations and activists should need to come in, yeah. Pressure them. There is indeed, public companies are facing much higher pressure from these external stakeholders compared to private companies. So at least I think the society is trying to move them to the right direction.
Yeah. So let's shift gears, because we've got a number of questions about kind of specific technologies. And one technology that came up was digital twins, and whether that technology in particular might have some value in better digital twins. That is I'm going to do my best. Sorry, I'm bringing you right out of your area of expertise. Digital twins is the concept of having a live digital replica of a product, like that you can see and monitor at all times, like an airplane engine or a car, and whether or not that type of technology might have some value in holding organizations accountable for their for transparency.
That's interesting. I am really I don't know that technology at all. But if the idea is the idea of, so this is like a virtual reality kind of thing, like a robot thing.
It could be. It could also just be a screen, basically something you're looking at a screen that is actually monitoring live, say the operation of your Tesla, and actually looking at the efficiency of it. And I think that there's
Right. So I think that they're actually so now I forgot the name of the company. So I don't think it's exactly this technology, but I think that there are some companies that are actually using sensors and videos to monitor, factory conditions, and they can observe those conditions, remotely. And so that's actually something that have some innovation that has been going on in the agricultural space, where sensors are being installed so that, for example, you can make sure that it's really organic practices during the whole growing process of the crops. But I do think this raises a very interesting research question in my mind, which is, even if the images are not live or from the real situation, perhaps these kind of technology can be utilized to motivate more, to motivate more responsible behavior. Like if you show people, if you don't do it right, there's some stressful, reaction or distressed reaction to what you are doing here, that could potentially trigger the actor to actually change and do it, more properly. This is a very vague idea, but I think that it holds some potential.
Well, it does speak to the importance of accurate monitoring, right, and the role technology can play in that. Let's talk about communication strategy for a moment. And so I have to admit, I laughed when you talked about a fact-based approach being effective in the U.S. market, right? Because we live in this time when we rarely can agree on what facts are and what's a fact and what's an alternative fact. But I mean, but more broadly, I wondered, how difficult is it to get that messaging right, and perhaps that it might be better just to really focus on the best possible practices, right, and let someone else do the messaging for you. And I guess the reason I'm asking this question is so many organizations were rightfully taken to task for greenwashing, right, over the last 20 years, where they were we've gotten so jaded that when an organization claims a practice, our reaction, and maybe I'm just terribly cynical, is to actually think, what are they compensating for? What are they trying to hide? And so I guess, I mean, there's a reason why you pointed to fact-based versus story-based, as different strategies, but how proven out do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I also want to clarify here is certainly, ensuring good practices, responsible practices is really the necessary first step, right? If you're doing very bad in your supply chain, I would not recommend you do a lot of transparent disclosure of how bad you are, right? So there's research showing that if you show really bad performance, it's actually going to hurt you. And I mean, that's a no-brainer. Now, so given the assumption, under the assumption that you're improving, right? Not necessarily you're already the best, right? You are improving, and you are really making a lot of effort into driving good practices in your supply chain. What our research is showing that actually having visibility into those practices and really understand what is the actual impact of those practices and being able to communicate those impacts in a precise way to your consumers is actually going to help. And that is actually what we show in another research project to counteract the consumer skepticism about greenwashing motives. And the key here is not really just communicate any message. It's actually communicate trustworthy, credible message. And the way to ensure that your messaging can be trustworthy and credible is precisely through having visibility in your supply chain. Because now you can really talk about the deep facts and the deep impacts of your efforts.
Great, thank you. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to try to get in 2 more questions.
Sure.
One is related to the pandemic, right? And coming out of this global disruption, a lot of organizations are looking at how they can localize their supply chains. Some are probably thinking about how do I achieve greater vertical integration. Is that a positive movement for transparency, or what might be some unintended consequences?
Yeah, so so it's not completely positive, but it has the positive side. And I think I want to, and this might be going, this might be going beyond the topic of transparency itself, and it's really about how you can ensure the resilience of your supply chain, right? And I think that companies really need to be careful in terms of redesigning their supply chain and really determine which part of the supply chain warrants coming back, being integrated to have the local component, and which part of the supply chain it really makes more sense to maintain and oversee or a second supplier. And then I would say for the unintended consequences part is that, imagine all the apparel and consumer electronics industry companies now all of a sudden pull all of their supply chain back to the US, then you are going to have a huge negative societal impact on all the people that you hire now in all your suppliers, right? They are going to go out of business, and millions of people are going to lose their jobs. And this is a very, very irresponsible practice on the part of these big brands. So I think that they really need to think about across their different products and services that they are offering, which of these are critical enough that you really need that responsive and very responsive capacity so that you can handle spikes in your supply chain when disruption potentially happen, and how you can then leave the rest still giving sufficient employment opportunities to all the people that you're hiring in the global supply chain, because they do have tremendous impact on their lives.
Great, that's such a great lens to look at that issue. Thank you. Okay, final question. Does a commitment to transparency have to be organization-wide, and does it have to start at the very top? Have you seen any examples of kind of renegade or kind of permission-free attempts at transparency from kind of middle of the organization or a particular part of an organization?
So I think that it's necessary for top management to commit the resources. So in the end of the day, I do believe that you need the commitment from the top in order to achieve the outcome. The aspiration can come from the middle, but whoever start that process need to have the drive to convince the boss that this is the right thing to do for the organization. Unless that person itself can move enough resources to complete it, it's a huge undertaking. So without top management support, it is very hard to pull off.
Great. Karen, thank you very much. This concludes our program. Thank you all for attending and your wonderful questions. Thank you, Karen Zheng, and thanks to our sponsor, Amazon Business. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Happy holiday. Bye.